Good day to all participants. I'm Professor Adatagal Cohen, the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Study of the Monotheistic Religions, abbreviated CISMOR, in Dosha University in Kyoto. And I'm very glad to host today's lecture. Thank you for joining us for the third seminar lecture in the series of the CISMOR conference on Jewish Studies number 11. The series titled Pilgrimage Through the Ages in Religious and Non-Religious Context. The first two lectures in the series were one on pilgrimage in Christian thought and practice, and the second on the non-religious pilgrimage in modern times. The third today will offer a special look at the Muslim tradition of pilgrimage to Mecca and other sacred places in Islam. I'm glad to have as our guest speaker today, Professor Daniella Talmon-Heller. Professor Daniella Talmon-Heller is an associate professor at the Department of Middle East Studies at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. She is currently the director of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters, and during 2021-2022 is a fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. Professor Talmon-Heller received her PhD degree in 1999 from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Then she spent 2 years as a postdoc researcher at Princeton University. And since 2001, she joined the faculty of the Department of Middle East Studies at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. Her research interests include the history and historiography of the medieval Middle East, Islamic thought and practice, and comparative religion. Currently, she's working on a research project entitled Sacred Scriptures as Sacred Objects, the Material Quran in the Medieval Middle East. Professor Talmon-Heller has published the following 2 volumes as sole author, and they are Islamic Piety in Medieval Syria, published by Braille in 2007. The second, Sacred Place and Sacred Time in Medieval Islamic Middle East, published last year by Edinburgh University Press. She also co-edited the volume titled Material Evidence and Narrative Sources, Interdisciplinary Studies of the History of Muslim Middle East, published by Braille in 2014. For a full list of her publications, please see her Academia EDU page, which I paste on the chat. Professor Talmon, speaking of pilgrimage in Islam, please, the mic and the video is yours.
Thank you for the invitation and for the collaboration between our 2 centers, which I hope will develop. We will have a guest lecture from your center at our place, unfortunately also on Zoom in May, Dr. Kinani. And I'm glad to be here. I would have been even happier to join you in Kyoto, of course, and sit around a seminar table and give a less formal lecture, which would have been nice. But as it is, we're thankful for Zoom, for allowing us to, meet without all the hassles of travel.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for the thorough introduction. I will share my screen. Just a minute. Right. Okay. So I've entitled the lecture Pilgrimage in Islam, but as you will see, I will focus on the Middle East. I'm really no expert on Muslims that are nearer to your location, and my talk will concentrate on the Middle East. But of course, most of the things I think I will say are relevant also to Muslim communities in Asia and in Southeastern Asia. Okay, I would like to begin this talk about pilgrimage, which is movement in space, with a few words about movement in time, and say something about the Hijri, or Islamic calendar. According to early Muslim scholars, the Quran calls for a strictly lunar calendar. Verse 37 of the 9th surah presents intercalation as one of the pagan Arabs' grave misdeeds. It accuses them of adding a month, called in the Quran the Nasi, roughly once every 3 years, which is also what we Jews do, in order to keep our lunar cycle in pace with the solar cycle, the natural cycle. But the Quran claims this was done maliciously in order to postpone the beginning of the sacred month and delay God's peace for the pagan Arabs' own convenience. As a result, they observed the Hajj, the pilgrimage, which was fixed in the beginning of one of the sacred months on the wrong days, thereby rendering the sacred profane and the profane sacred, right? So the Quran reads the month postponed, and Nasi is an increase of unbelief, whereby the unbelievers go astray. 1 year they make it profane and hallow it another, to agree with the number of months that God has hallowed, and so profaned what God has hallowed. Medieval Muslim scholars stressed that the abolition of intercalation, that is, giving up the arrangement of leap years, restored the divinely prescribed natural order and ensured the timely observation of sacred rites. Modern scholars of Islam present the repeal of intercalation in the establishment of a purely lunar calendar, which is 11 days shorter than the solar year, as an attempt to break away from the pagan past and usher in a strictly new monotheistic era. It detaches all rites and festivals from the natural cycle and from the seasons, and dedicates them, as it were, to God alone. A more sociological interpretation of this historical reform is suggested by the Japanese scholar Hideyuki Iyo, who explains that by introducing the lunar calendar, Muhammad changed the traditional pilgrimage and trading system in Arabia. Since the maintenance of order among the pre-Islamic tribes depended on this pilgrimage cycle, the adoption of the purely lunar cycle triggered vast societal changes, which facilitated the establishment of the new Islamic order. Finally, by adapting a calendar of their own, Muslims craved out a separate and unique identity vis-a-vis the other monotheistic religions. The early Islamic calendar, judging by the Quran and Hadith, included only 2 festivals, which I've put up on my slide: the month-long dawn to sunset fasting on Ramadan on the 9th month, and the pilgrimage to Mecca on the Dhul al-Hijjah, the 12th month. The 2 annual festivals were celebrated immediately after the fast and the pilgrimage, allegedly already by the Prophet Muhammad, although they're not mentioned explicitly in the Quran. With time, however, the Islamic calendar acquired many contested annual commemorations of the life of the Prophet and visitations of numerous sacred sites and tombs of holy men of sorts, all Islamic and local. And those will be the subjects of my talk. So we will address the Hajj first and explain how, theologically and politically, the pre-Islamic pagan rites at the shrine of the black stone of the Kaaba became one of the pillars, 5 pillars, of the strictly monotheistic religion of Islam, and a hallmark of the unity of the Muslim community. We will walk through some of the intricate rituals of the 5 days long Hajj and discuss their symbolic, historical, and mystical meanings, as well as some of the rituals that accompany the departing caravans and returning pilgrims in cities such as Cairo and Damascus. So, every free adult, male or female Muslim, who is physically and mentally healthy, sorry, I see that this somehow, the map, let's fix that. Okay, right. So every Muslim, male or female, as I said, who is physically and mentally healthy and has the means, is obliged to perform the Hajj at least once in his lifetime. The destination of the Hajj, as you all must know, is in the city of Mecca, in the western stretch of Arabia, what is Saudi Arabia nowadays. The Hajj begins with the ritual of Ihram outside of the sacred precincts of Mecca, where the pilgrim goes through a ritual of purification, which ideally is not only bodily cleansing, but also a spiritual preparation to leave everything in his regular life behind and dedicate his time only to God and to the rituals he had ordered. After this ritual cleansing and spiritual preparation, the pilgrim dons the ihram garment, which you will see in a minute. All men wear a garment made out of 2 white pieces of white. Maybe we should see it immediately right here. Right? So the men wear white cloth, seamless cloth, made with one shoulder bare. The women remain in their regular, modest, shari clothes, and even if they do not do so back home, must leave their faces and their hands bare. I'll go back to just that we see that the Hajj is actually a series of rituals. It begins with a visit to the Kaaba in Mecca and a circumambulation of the Black Stone and several other rites. It continues on a journey to the plain of, to an encampment outside of Mecca in a place called Mina, to a gathering at a place called Muzdalifah, and to I'll show in a moment, a solemn standing on the plain of Arafat in prayer, listening to sermons and meditating. This is considered to be a second high point of the Hajj after the circumambulation of the Kaaba itself. And then the pilgrims are ready to make the almost 20 kilometers journey back to Mecca with 2 other stops. One again at Muzdalifah, where they perform a symbolic stoning of pillars, which are either a personification, as it were, of the devil or of their base instincts. There are also other explanations. And then they're ready to return to Mecca and circumambulate the Kaaba once more. All this is based on Quranic commandments appearing in Surah 2 and Surah 22 and in a few other places. Regard the following. And when we appointed the house to be a place of visitation for the people and a sanctuary, Take to yourself Abraham's station for a place of prayer. And we made covenant with Abraham and Ishmael, purify my house for those that shall go about it, and those that cleave to it, to those who bow and prostrate themselves. Proclaim among men the pilgrimage, and they shall come unto thee on foot and upon every lean beast. They shall come from every deep ravine, and mention God's name on days well known. Over such beasts of the flocks he had provided them. So eat and feed the wretched poor. Then let them complete the rites prescribed for them, perform their vows, and again circumambulate the ancient house. Now, those Quranic versions make a wonderful Islamization of ancient pagan rites, which the Quran actually does not conceal the fact that Islam had appropriated an existing pagan tradition and remade it into a monotheistic rite. The establishment of the shrine is attributed to Abraham, the first prophet of monotheism, and to his son Ishmael, the father of all Arabs. Hence, the Muslim are portrayed as restoring the shrine to its original purpose and purifying from generations of contamination by idol worship. The rites, as I have listed them looking at the previous slide, were known to have been pagan rites. The Quran has left those rites almost intact. There are small changes. They changed their timing with the change of the calendar, as I had explained earlier, but has invested them with a completely new history and new meaning. Later, Hadith literature, after the Quran, exposes some qualms early Muslims had regarding the continuation of seemingly irrational pagan rites, such as the kissing of the black stone and throwing pebbles at pillars, especially as the central message of Muhammad was the abolition of the pre-Islamic beliefs and customs. Several strands of explaining away any pagan content of the pilgrimage rites were developed by Muslim theologians. One connects all rites to Abraham, Ishmael, and Hagar, thus making all the Hajj into a journey in their footsteps, as it were. So the circumambulation of the black stone, which we see here on the right, is explained as a reenactment of the rite Abraham and Ishmael had performed after establishing the house, the first house ever for the worship of God alone. And here we have the same site in a pretty certificate of pilgrimage, which one of the pilgrims had brought back home to Damascus after performing the Hajj in the 16th century. Here we see another picture of the circumambulation called tawaf in Arabic. And this is, according to most pilgrims, a high point of the pilgrimage, an incredible feeling of brotherhood and unity. I'm sure you've already talked about the anthropological explanations for pilgrimage. I probably not need to repeat. Ada, have you went through Victor Turner's concept of comunitas?
We have it
I can't
mentioned
hear
by
you.
Orally Moore. She gave the basic
I
ideas.
could imagine.
Yes.
Right. So I will not repeat. I will just remind you that Turner very appealingly described the wonderful feeling of fraternity and spiritual elevations that pilgrims feel, perhaps even just for a short while, when they are surrounded by so many other people who have come for the same purpose and partake in the same rites. And I think there's no better idea, no better location or no better rite that seems to give evidence to that Turner has a point here than the tawaf of the Hajj. But then more critical eyes would argue with Turner and mention incidents of strife even in a sacred place like that between Sunni and Shiis and between pilgrims of various ethnic origins, which sometimes cannot overcome their disagreements and animosities even on such a special moment. But usually, as most pilgrims testify, this is really an amazing moment of spiritual elevation, and I will in a minute read a short quotation from a famous pilgrim who gives an eloquent expression to this feeling. So after having performed the tawaf, the pilgrims turn to another rite, which is performed very near the Kaaba, and this is called sa'i. It's a brisk walk taken 7 times along the 400 meters of this long corridor. The corridor is, of course, a modern addition. It used to be an open-air space, a route connecting 2 low hills called Safa and Marwa. Again, a ritual performed, as far as we know, by the pagan Arabs before Islam and given a new meaning under Islam. For those who seek in the rites of the Hajj a repetition or going in the footsteps of Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael, this brisk walk symbolizes Hagar's search for water in the desert, water for her son Ishmael. But as I said, there are also symbolic interpretations of those rites, and both the tawaf and the sa'i as seen as the tawaf as a means of directing your heart towards the center and towards God, and the sa'i as searching for the right path. At the lower picture, we can see the pilgrims spending a night in the open air. Luckily, the climate in Arabia allows that almost year-round. As you remember, the rites are not fixed in one season. Every year, each year the pilgrimage begins 11 days earlier, according to the lunar calendar, and therefore every 3 years the pilgrimage begins a month earlier, and a pilgrim may find himself performing the Hajj in all seasons. The Hajj is performed in all seasons. So here we see the pilgrims spending the night, either on the way to the wukuf and again returning to Mecca. This is the wukuf, the standing on Mount Arafat, which is supposedly the second high point of the pilgrimage after the tawaf, the first circumambulation of the Kaaba. And the pilgrims flock up the hill for hours, stand in the sun or in the cold, meditating, praying, and listening to sermons. Again, very impressive. All the men dressed in white, heads bare. This is how Malcolm X, the famous African-American activist, has described his experience. There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood. This is what the anthropologist Victor Turner has coined comunitas. Unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. And I recommend watching this little YouTube piece made in 1992, quite a while after Malcolm X's death, portraying his Hajj and this experience as he describes it. There's no doubt that the value of the sanctuary of Mecca as a focal point for the nascent Muslim Ummah, 1400 years back, 14 and a half centuries back, neutralized much of the resistance of the Meccans, who were the custodians of the pagan shrine, and gave the new religion a distinct sacred place of its own and a powerful religious uniting experience. Modern commentators stress the value of the Hajj as a great political get-together of Muslims from all the corners of the east of the earth. And so actually, as has done, for example, even from a secular standpoint, as has done famously Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, who was not a religious Muslim, but he stressed the potential of the Hajj as a not only pan-Arab, but pan-Muslim occasion with a huge political potential. Of course, enhancing the sense of belonging to the Muslim Ummah. Many of the pilgrims come for personal reasons, of course, not for political reasons. And one of the high points for them may be drinking from the water of the Zamzam, called Zamzam well or Zamzam spring, who is right by the Kaaba. And it is believed that the Zamzam serves the purpose of the person who drinks it. So if someone drinks the water of the Zamzam in order to purify himself, he will be purified. If he drinks it believing that it has a medicinal value, it may cure him of cancer. There are many such stories in modern versions of medieval miracles of healing and of disease and disabilities attributed to this place and water. Before we leave the Hajj, I would like to show you a favorite miniature of mine, which depicts the Muslim pilgrims departing from Egypt for Mecca in the late 19th century. And what we can see in this miniature is a procession of camels. The first camel carrying an ornate yellow mahmal. Mahmal is an Arabic word, unique for this tent-looking thing, carried to Mecca annually from the 13th century and until 1953. The last mahmal ended up in the Islamic Museum of Cairo in the late 50s when the right was abolished. What was the purpose of this mahmal and the procession? The procession brought the kiswa, the heavy black or sometimes white cloth embroidered in gold with Quranic verses and other pious statements, renewed each year. So each year after the pilgrimage, the kiswa is taken off the black stone taken off the Kaaba and replaced by a new kiswa, traditionally sent by the caliph. We have already in the 7th century, apparently, the caliphs began sending the kiswa to Mecca, symbolizing their patronage of the sacred place, and also, of course, their wealth and their ability to produce this luxurious and beautiful cloth. In the 10th century, probably, the Egyptians began to send a kiswa of their own from Cairo to Mecca, traversing the 1,600 kilometers distance between the two cities. And in the 13th century, the Mamluk ruler of Egypt and Syria, the Sultan Baybars, added this new feature to the procession, producing not only the kiswa, the cover, but also this tent, this mahmal, which became the symbol of the procession of the pilgrims to Mecca. I will say one more thing, that the cloth, having been or being in constant touch with the sacred place, was accorded magical or wonderful powers. And little pieces from the kiswa were really a sought after relic. And when the kiswa was brought back, it was often hung in public so that people could touch it and bring upon themselves some of the blessings, or so they believed, bring upon themselves some of the blessings of the sacred place. And some could not resist the temptation to take a little piece back home and keep it with them as an amulet full of healing and blissful powers. A famous hadith quotes the Prophet Muhammad restricting travel for devotional purposes to 3 places only. This is articulated in a hadith, a saying by the Prophet Muhammad, known as Hadith Shad al-Rihal. La tushadu al-Rihal illa ila 3 masajidin. المسجد الحرام ومسجد هذا والمسجد الأقصى. Do not prepare your saddles for but 3 mosques. The sacred mosques, which everyone understands as Mecca, my mosque in Al-Medina, and Al-Aqsa mosque, interpreted widely as the mosque in Jerusalem, the furthest mosque in Jerusalem. Both Muslim scholars and scholars of Islam, academic scholars of Islam, have delved on the possible meanings of this saying. Does it forbid visitation of all other sites? Does it promise recompense for visiting these 3 mosques? Or perhaps does it rate the importance of the 3 cities in descending order? Mecca, Medina, and finally Jerusalem. Medina had no sanctity prior to Muhammad's emigration, the Hijrah, in 622, an event that was chosen some 20 years later as the starting point of the Muslim calendar we had just discussed. Don't know why, but here I also need to move this a little bit aside so that you can see both the pre-modern depiction of the tomb complex of the Prophet and this enlightened photograph of the place today. So what we can see here is the house of allegedly the house of the Prophet and his place of prayer. And the three tombs, most important of course, is the tomb of the Prophet himself, but by him were buried two of his best companions and friends who became the first and second caliphs of Islam, Caliph Abu Bakr and Caliph Omar, all three buried in the same chamber. On the right is shown the minbar, the pulpit, which the Prophet used when he preached to the flock. He would climb up the stairs and address the audience, and this is exactly what preachers do today, every Friday noon, when they address the Muslims gathered in the great mosques all over the Muslim world. This is considered to be Fatima's tree, the tree of the daughter of the Prophet, who is a very important figure in Shia Islam, and we'll talk about Shia Islam afterwards. And as you can see, the place was well lit up already in medieval times, right? We can see plenty of light here, which of course, I think in all religions symbolizes spirituality and the divine light. We can see plenty of mosques, plenty of lamps donated by Muslim rulers and also by regular Muslims throughout the ages in order to enlighten this extremely sacred place for Muslims. But as I said, it had no prior sanctity, unlike Mecca, which we've stressed its earlier sanctity, its pre-Islamic sanctity. Medina, as far as we know, had no such status before Muhammad made it his city. So the Medina had served a safe haven for the Muslims who had left Mecca with the Prophet. It remained his home and headquarters until his death, thereby acquiring an especially dear place in the hearts of Muslims. There is hardly a Muslim who would not visit Medina or who did not visit Medina on his way to or from the Hajj and pay his tribute to the Prophet at the complex, which includes, as we have seen, his house, his mosque, and his grave. You could return from Medina also with a certificate of pilgrimage, which undoubtedly pilgrims upon return placed in a prominent spot in their houses. This one was supplied also in the 16th century with this somewhat primitive drawing of the sacred mosque and the following inscription: "Praise be to God who exalted Medina and protected her. He preferred her to other places and chose her, and he called her Taiba because she's fragrant, because of the nobility of the beloved, and gratified her land. And I declare that Muhammad is his servant, which is and there is no God but God." This is, of course, the Shahada, the declaration of the kernel of Islamic theology, which is another one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Ashhadu inna la ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullahi. He has no peer. I declare Muhammad is his servant and his messenger, whom his Lord called Yasin and Taha. Those are 2 Quranic, somewhat enigmatic letters or names. Blessings of God be upon him as well as peace. Said the prophet, blessings of God be upon him as well as peace. Whoever visits my grave will be guaranteed my intercession on the day of resurrection. So the visit to the prophet's tomb is not a religious obligation. It was even contested, as I will show in a minute. So it is not performed in fulfillment of a Quranic decree, but the saying attributed to the prophet, whoever visits my grave will be guaranteed my intercession, accords the place a powerful magnetism, right? The pilgrims were and are still drawn to the place, hoping to receive the intercession of the prophet on the day of a resurrection, and if possible, also his blessings until the day of resurrection. That is in their present lives. The main ritual that was conducted in a holy place, such as the prophet's tomb, both on an individual and communal basis by Sunnis and Shi'is, men and women, was and is undoubtedly prayer. Putting their faith in the presence and intercession of the holy man on the site, and the blessings of the shrine itself, devotees uttered fervent and on occasion tearful prayers and private invocation at shrines, or circumambulated the tombstone as if it was the Kaaba. Some visitors strengthened their supplication by touching the cover or silver railing that protected the tomb, taking an oath, which may have included a promise to return to the place had their wish been fulfilled, to give their thanks. Some would recite poems and hadith, sayings of the Prophet, or some excerpts from the biographies of the Prophet. The great medieval scholar and Sufi Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who lived in the late 11th and beginning of the 12th century, explains that even the virtues of the holiest cities of Mecca and Medina are enhanced by the arrival of pilgrims and the amassment of their prayers. Comparing the efficacy of prayer at different sites in sayings such as, and this is a typical saying, a prayer in Mecca equals 100,000 prayers elsewhere. A prayer in Medina equals 1,000 prayers elsewhere. And prayer in Jerusalem is worth 500 prayers elsewhere, is a typical strategy of the literature written in praise of places and times, known in Arabic as Fadail lil-Amakin and Fadail lil-Awqat. The superior sanctity of Mecca is reflected in the unique, of course, in those sayings. Mecca appears first with this, hard to imagine, exaggerated number of each prayer in Mecca is worth 100,000 prayers elsewhere. And its superior sanctity, of course, is undoubted, and it's reflected also in the unique demand to wear the special ihram, to perform the special rites of purification upon crossing the pilgrimage boundaries, which is not demanded from a pilgrim coming to a Medina or any other place, of course, and the ban on the entrance of non-Muslims to the city. So non-Muslims may spend a short time in Medina, but they are not allowed to enter Mecca. This is an age-old prohibition, going back either to the Prophet or more likely to the second Caliph, the second Omar, who declared this prohibition. Actually, this ban had not prevented some Christian adventurers of all ages to be present at the Hajj disguised as Muslims, and some, of course, had published their accounts in travelogues and memoirs, giving us a good sense of what the rites looked like in earlier times. Third in rank, as we have read, Jerusalem. Now, okay. Jerusalem, what we see here is an aerial view of the of the Haram, the sacred rectangular, most sacred part of the city, including, of course, the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock, Qubat al-Sakhra, and several dozens, we can see a few, of smaller domes, arches, gates, buildings, which had also acquired special sanctity throughout the ages, and I will explain this phenomenon in the moment. Before we leave the slide, I will show the Wailing Wall, which is the most sacred spot for Jews in Jerusalem, being a remnant of the Second Temple, destroyed in the year 700 AD. And as you can see, this wall was actually not part of the temple itself, which stood most likely where the Dome of the Rock stands today, but part of the outer wall, which surrounded the Temple Mount and actually elevated the area for the building of the temple. So, but since this is all this wall dates back to the outer wall of the temple built by Herod at the beginning of the 1st century AD. This is the place of pilgrimage and prayer for Jews. If anyone is interested in the political implications of this proximity, I'm sure you're well aware of them, and of Israeli rule over this extremely sacred place for Islam, I will be happy to address it as much as I can in the Q&A. But now I would like to say something about the sources of Jerusalem's sanctity to Islam. So Jerusalem is known as the first. So Jerusalem's sanctity is based on commentaries on the Quran. It is not actually mentioned by name in the Quran, but almost all commentators, including very early ones, found it implicitly in several verses, one of which I will quote in a minute. It is mentioned in the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, which were written in the 8th and 9th century, as the destination of his miraculous night journey. It is mentioned in many oral traditions transmitted by and about the Prophet Muhammad, and it is the focus of this literature of merits of places, Fadail, specifically known as Fadail al-Quds, treatises in praise of Jerusalem, which were, several of them were compiled in the 11th century, and even more were written after the Crusaders had overtaken Jerusalem and built and made this Temple Mount into the headquarters of the Templar order of warriors. So during this period, when there were crosses over the domes of Al-Aqsa and Qubat al-Sakhra, the sanctity of Jerusalem became even closer to the hearts of Muslims, and we find a proliferation of treatises in praise of the city, a genre which continues to be written, I think, until nowadays. So what do those compilations say? They declare Jerusalem third in sanctity after Mecca and Medina, a second in antiquity, claiming that when the earth was created, the black stone, the Kaaba, was the first to appear, and then the stone, or the stone in the rock of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, and first as direction of prayer. So the early Muslim community, and this is hinted to in the Quran and explicitly told in the biographies of the Prophet, the first direction of prayer of the young Ummah, the young community of believers that gathered around Muhammad and accepted his prophethood, was Jerusalem. They would turn their faces towards Jerusalem while praying. And this had changed some 18 months after the community had left Mecca and settled in Al-Medina. Then the Prophet, as it were, looked back and turned the faces of the people in prayer towards what he explained as the permanent, their future and permanent direction of prayer, the Kaaba in Mecca, thereby also showing the way to the later conquest of Mecca and appropriation of the Kaaba for Islamic ritual. But Jerusalem was first. It came before Mecca as a direction of prayer. All treatises mentioned that Jerusalem was an abode of the prophets, of David, of Solomon, of Jesus, all important figures in the Quran and in Islamic lore, and many of them had Abraham, Ishmael had visited Jerusalem, if not actually lived in Jerusalem, which of course ties the city to the sacred history of monotheism, of which Islam is an heir. Jerusalem is portrayed as a locus of miracles, and the night journey, which I will address in a minute, is of course one of such. And as we have already read in the hadith about the weight of prayer in Jerusalem, those compilations in praise of the city promise grand rewards for good deeds performed in the city. So if one prays in Jerusalem, gives alms in Jerusalem, fasts in Jerusalem, does any good deed, his rewards will be multiplied. Of course, we have different imaginary numbers given in different treatises, but the idea is one. Having made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, one will be rewarded not only for the visit, but also for every pious deed, every act of devotion he will perform during this pilgrimage and during his stay. The most miraculous event that ties the Muslims to Jerusalem is, of course, his visit of the city during his night journey, depicted according to most commentators of the Quran in Surah 17. So this is what is said there: "Glory be to him who made his servant go on a night from the sacred mosque to the remote mosque. Subhanallahu li asra bi abdihi min al-Masjid al-Haram ila al-Masjid al-Aqsa, from the sacred mosque to the remote mosques, of which we have blessed the precincts, so that we may show to him some of our signs. Surely he is the hearing, the seeing." So this is the first verse of Surah 17, and the journey described or hinted to in this verse is depicted in the 14th century Ilhani miniature you can see here. The prophet riding this half human, half beastly creature, miraculous creature called Al-Burak, who has the tail of forgot the name of the bird. Can anyone help me?
Peacock.
Peacock, right. Thank you. Yes, who has the tail of the peacock and the wings, who enables it to rise and fly. And here we see the prophet who had been taken from his bed in Mecca before. It's an early episode in his biography as a prophet. He was taken from his bed in Mecca by the angel Gabriel, seated on Al-Buak, on this wonderful creature, and taken in an instant straight to Jerusalem. And what we can see here is the rock on Temple Mount. He had landed on the rock. It shows its footprint. The Muslims show his footprints on the rock, and then taken without the beast, miraculously taken up to heaven, not to stay there, but just to visit, to pray in front of all the prophets that came before him, of course, positioning him as the head and final prophet, and to speak with his Lord. He was not allowed to see his Lord, which no human can, according to Muslim theology, but he could speak to the prophets and speak to his Lord. Some of the commandments of Islam, such as 5 prayers a day, are attributed to this night journey, which ended with the descent of the prophet from the heavens back to Jerusalem, to the rock, where he hopped again on Al-Burak to return in an instant to his home in Mecca. So this story ties the prophet and ties the Muslims to Jerusalem even more powerfully than all other things, than all the other merits in praise of the city. So the ancient rock, which allegedly was the destination of the night journey and carries the footprint of that miraculous event, was covered by a beautiful dome some 70 years after the prophet's death, to become the major attraction for Muslim pilgrims to Jerusalem. What was actually the main message of that unprecedentedly sumptuous shrine, which is not a proper mosque, right? It is like a Kaaba, a place of circumambulation and private prayer, but not a proper mosque in which Muslims can stand in lines facing the Kaaba and performing the bodily gestures which Muslims perform while prayer. Now, this is a very really an unusual building, and we can see early historians of Islam and of course latter-day scholars of the religion speculating what was the actual purpose of the Caliph. The Caliph Abd al-Malik belonged to the first dynasty which ruled the Muslim empire from Damascus, not very far from Jerusalem. What was the main purpose of the Caliph Abd al-Malik when he decided to spend so much money and engage so much workers and commission the best artisans in order to build these monuments. So it seems natural to claim that this was done in commemoration of the Prophet's ascension to heaven, but actually the inscriptions which decorate the inner dome of the building, which miraculously stands in place since 692, despite several earthquakes that had shaken this area, the building stands. Of course, the dome has been renovated. Some of the tiles have been changed, but the building stands, and the inner decorations and inscriptions are there from the late 7th century, and they do not mention the night journey, which would have been odd if the building was actually built as a commemoration of that event. So there are other ideas regarding the building as a symbolic celebration of Islam's victory over Christianity, over the Christianity as a religion, or over Byzantium as a rival empire. And indeed, many verses, Quranic verses of this inscription refer to Islamic theology in disagreement with Christian and Jewish dogma. So this makes good sense that the whole wonderful building is actually a proclamation of Islam's theology and victory. One can also say that it was built to outshine local churches. Jerusalem was full of churches in the 7th century, or of the most wonderful Byzantine church, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. There's also evidence that Abd al-Malik wanted to imitate the Temple of David in Solomon. We will find many Muslims today denying the existence of the Temple of David and Solomon altogether, or denying its existence in Jerusalem, as if accepting this historical and archaeological fact would be recognizing Israel's legitimacy over the place. But in the Middle Ages, Muslims had no problem to speak of the Temple of David and Solomon, and perhaps the Caliph Abd al-Malik, seeing himself or wanting to depict himself as a great ruler, actually wanted to imitate the project that was attributed to them. And taking into account the very specific political situation in Abd al-Malik's time, he may have wished to establish an alternative pilgrimage destination for Syrian Muslims. This sounds heretical, of course, because the pilgrimage, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, is an explicit Quranic commandment. But since in his time Mecca was ruled by a rival caliph, it may well have been that Abd al-Malik wished to divert at least the Syrian Muslims from the Hajj and from possibly joining his adversary in Mecca. Be it as it may, the Dome of the Rock was coupled several years later by the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, which explicitly refers by name to Surah 17:1, right, which mentions Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, the furthest mosque, as the destiny of the night journey. Its current dimensions, and we can see it standing here, its current dimensions date back to the restorations of the 11th century. This building did collapse with the strong earthquakes of the 11th century, probably even earlier. Unlike, as I said, the Dome of the Rock, probably because of its location on the rock, it was less prone to be damaged. So following the earthquakes, the erstwhile rulers of Jerusalem, the Fatimids, rebuilt it and then added a number of smaller buildings to the Haram, which I've shown earlier on the area with the aerial view of the sacred place, such as the Chamber of David, the Mosque of the Cradle of Jesus, the Dome of the Chain and the Gate of Gabriel, etc., etc., which gave Muslims additional, Muslim pilgrims, additional sites to visit, to pray at, to admire, and the very first extant guide for the Muslim pilgrim in Jerusalem, written by a resident of the city known by Ibn al-Mubaja, recommends ritual prayer and supererogatory prayer, that is additional prayers, at all those spots. Right? And we can see some of them in this beautiful map of the Haram, of the sacred space. This is, of course, the Dome of the Rock, and here it is very evident that it is not a regular mosque, but this octagonal building surrounding the rock, enabling very contested circumambulation, contested because it is a right that belongs to the Meccan sanctuary alone. In any case, people can gather, admire the rock, say individual personal prayers, sit and meditate or read the Quran. But if they actually want to pray, they could do it in Al-Aqsa, which is a proper large mosque, or on the whole outdoor area surrounding those two buildings. It's all considered a mosque. It's on Ramadan, on the holy month of the fast, and on the holidays, this whole place is crowded with people standing in lines, praying towards Mecca, of course. Not towards the, make it, it's very explicitly, you may, if you pray in Al-Aqsa, you turn your back to the rock of Jerusalem and your face southwards towards Mecca. So the hierarchy between the three destinations of pilgrimage, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, is kept. This is a 2017 photograph taken in 2017, and it shows triumphant, rather angry Turkish tourist pilgrims. Where you can see the Dome of the Rock behind them, and you can see that they are exhibiting the mosque, the two flags, the Palestinian flag and the Turkish flag, and raising Qurans and see Qurans decorated with the picture of the Dome of the Rock of Qubat al-Sakhra. And this is, of course, a political statement combined with the act of devotion. Right? Those are undoubtedly pilgrims who came for religious reasons to the sacred city, but they have also a political message, defying or protesting against the Israeli rule over the place, over all Palestine, I imagine, but especially over the Qubat al-Sakhra and the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, which they regard as Muslim sacred space, which may not be contaminated by presence of non-Muslims, not to speak of the rule of non-Muslims of Israel I should add, many devout Muslims would not visit Jerusalem at all under those circumstances. A very well-known a spiritual leader, or scholar of Islam, called Al-Qardawi. Some of you may have heard him. He's very prominent in the media. He was very prominent in the media. Actually banned this devotional visit to Jerusalem as long as it is under Israel's rule. Palestinians themselves, most of them, actually wish Muslims from the world to come visit the holy places, contribute, of course, to the economy of Palestinians, but also strengthen Muslim presence in the place. Before we leave Jerusalem, let me see how I'm doing with time. Okay, have enough time. Before we leave Jerusalem, I'd like to present a short autobiographical passage that connects Jerusalem and Mecca, written, again, back to the Middle Ages, written by the 13th century historian Ibn Wasil. So Ibn Wasil tells us the following. That year, 642, according to the Hijri calendar, which is 1227 Common Era, while he was in Jerusalem, dwelling at the madrasa, the educational institution of El Salahiyah, my father wrote to the Sultan and asked his permission to apparently leave his post for a while and go to the Hajj. The permission was given, and my father donned the special Hajj garment, the ihram, which we mentioned earlier, in the Dome of the Rock, and traveled to Mecca. He performed the rites of the pilgrimage and stayed at Mecca until the following year's pilgrimage caravan, returning to Jerusalem only in 626. During these months, I occupied his place at the madrasa. So the point which I wanted to emphasize was the donning of the ihram, donning of the special garment of the Hajj, following the bodily cleansing and the ritual of spiritual purification in Jerusalem, which was considered an extra act of devotion. I could not bring a photograph of Ibn Wasil's father donning the ihram, of course, but what I did bring is the photograph from the Queen Alia airport in Amman. And you can see that the airport has Ghurfat al-Ihram room, which enables people wary of crossing the borders of the sacred precincts on their flight to perform the ritual of Ihram and don the special clothing before they board their plane. Also an act of extra piety. Okay, so we've seen the travel to Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem were known acts of devotion, or still are well-known and sought-after acts of devotion, but naturally they can be undertaken only by privileged few. A visit to a nearby holy site was and is feasible for the many. So the establishment and visitation, ziyarah in Arabic, of such sites became an extremely popular feature of religious life in Muslim societies in the late Middle Ages and in the Ottoman period, especially those under the influence of Sufism, mystical Islam. Sufi Islam was characterized by great admiration towards ascetics and mystics who were perceived as saintly figures of God, charismatic leaders in piety, blessed with spiritual perfection and superhuman powers. More often or not, the abode and later the tomb of such a person attracted visitors. Due to the belief of the persistence of the powers of a saintly man after his death, Mausolea, ranging from the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina we had just visited, to rural shrines dedicated to almost anonymous local saintly figures, became destinations of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage for those seeking blessings and intercession, baraka and shafa'a, those in search of mystical inspiration, those wishing to commemorate God and his friends, his awliya, a ritual named dhikr, those wishing to make or fulfill vows, and those coming to celebrate the birthday, the Maulid, or a festival of the saintly person. And in the 20th century, those coming to mark national political gatherings. So again, religion and politics very often intertwine and mix. And also the ziyara, which in the Middle Ages was an act of devotion, as were also the mawalid and the mawasim, the communal celebrations in sacred places. Many were politicized in the era of nationalism. And I'll show one example, the example of Nabi Musa. Nabi Musa, known to Muslims as the tomb of the Prophet Moses. Jews claim that his place of burial is unknown, but the Muslims actually point to several places in Transjordan, in Damascus, and by Jericho in Palestinian territories as the burial place of the great prophet Moses, who came, of course, before Muhammad. The same sultan who initiated the mahmal, the yellow tent we had looked at earlier, also built this shrine at the site of Nabi Musa, the site of the prophet Moses. What we see here is an Ottoman building. The earlier building was reconstructed in the late 19th century. This is a pilgrimage undertaken in 1920 from Jerusalem to Nabi Musa, a hotbed of Palestinian nationalism, which I don't think I have time to talk about at the moment, but this is a classical, sorry?
We are past time.
Oh, we are past time?
Yes. We're supposed to finish by 10 minutes from now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then
I sent you messages, but you didn't.
I was preoccupied.
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay, sorry. Yes. So I will let me just show two more pictures and I will end my talk. Yeah, I want to show a typical little shrine which used to draw and still draws local pilgrimage, and the angry reaction of Islamic fundamentalists such as ISIS to the whole concept of sacred space and pilgrimage to sacred places. This is not a new phenomena, but we can see it in its very extreme under ISIS, turned against Sunni and against Shi'i, and I will end with one of the most important sites of pilgrimage for the Shi'i Muslims, Karbala in Iraq, which was also attacked, yes, we will end with this, also attacked time and again by Sunni fundamentalists who opposed to any pilgrimage but the Hajj, and especially to the sacred sites of Shi'i Islam. So I will end here. Sorry for going over time, and I'll be happy to listen to comments and answer questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating. And thank you again, Professor Talmon-Heller. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Ada.
Very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.